On a planet far away from the familiar stars of human imagination, there existed a civilization that was quietly remarkable, yet incredibly vulnerable. The planet itself was a study in contradictions. Its landscapes were breathtaking, dotted with crystalline mountains that shimmered under the twin suns, and vast oceans that reflected the light in dazzling colors. Rivers carved their way through lush valleys, and thick forests stretched for hundreds of kilometers, hiding creatures and ecosystems that had never been catalogued or understood. It was a world that seemed perfect on the surface, a paradise for those who could survive within it. But beneath this stunning beauty, the planet hid a harsh reality. Its surface was treacherous, in many places volcanic eruptions, sudden storms, and shifting terrains made life difficult. Only the most adaptable creatures could endure its unpredictable nature, and the dominant species, the aliens, had evolved to survive it, but just barely. These aliens were not humanoid in form, but their intelligence was profound, rivaling or surpassing many species across galaxies. They had complex societies built around cooperation, innovation, and the careful use of technology. Their cities were marvels of engineering, crafted to harmonize with nature rather than dominate it. Massive towers spiraled toward the sky, built from materials that seemed alive, shimmering with colors that changed depending on the angle of the light. Bridges connected floating platforms above deep chasms, and energy flowed through conduits in the ground like rivers of light, powering entire regions without harming the environment. For outsiders, this civilization might have seemed idyllic, almost utopian, a perfect balance between technological progress and natural preservation. But appearances can be deceiving. Despite all these advancements, the alien society was fragile. They were accustomed to a life of careful planning, of maintaining balance, and of avoiding unnecessary risk. Their population was limited, and though they were technologically clever, they had never faced an external threat of a scale that could endanger their entire civilization. Their ancestors had fought wars, certainly, but those conflicts were generally contained, involving skirmishes or localized disputes. They had never encountered an enemy that could attack every city at once, overwhelm their defenses, or annihilate their people in a single sweep. For generations, they had lived under the assumption that their intelligence and careful strategies were enough to ensure survival. They believed that their advanced technology, combined with meticulous planning, could solve almost any problem. All of that changed when a new threat emerged on the horizon. This enemy was not like anything they had encountered before. Reports first came in as small disturbances at the edges of their territories, strange lights in the skies, unexplained energy pulses, and occasional attacks on isolated settlements. At first, the aliens assumed these were minor raids, nothing their defenses couldn't handle. They dispatched small patrols and scouts, confident in their ability to monitor and respond. But as the weeks passed, the situation escalated rapidly. Entire regions were suddenly under siege. Cities that had stood for centuries were attacked without warning, and the aliens realized with growing horror that they were facing a force far beyond their previous experience. The enemy was relentless, aggressive, and highly adaptable. Every strategy the aliens devised was met with countermeasures, and each victory they managed to claim came at a devastating cost. Panic began to spread, first among the leaders and strategists, and eventually throughout the general population. For the first time, the aliens felt a sense of helplessness that was unfamiliar and terrifying. Citizens who had grown up with the confidence that their society was unbreakable suddenly found themselves in a state of constant fear. Families abandoned their homes to flee advancing enemies. Merchants saw their goods destroyed, and communities that had been self-sufficient for generations now faced shortages of essential supplies, the very foundations of their civilization. The order, the stability, the careful balance they had maintained for centuries were beginning to crumble. And yet, amidst this chaos, the alien leaders continued to deliberate, sometimes endlessly. They held emergency meetings in grand halls of shining stone and glass, debating which strategies might turn the tide without putting their people at risk. Every decision carried weight, and every mistake could be fatal. The burden of leadership had never felt so heavy that the situation grew more desperate. The leaders explored every possible solution. They analyzed past conflicts, studied enemy tactics, and tried to predict the next moves of their adversaries. They considered diplomatic negotiations, hoping to find a peaceful resolution, but the enemy showed no interest in compromise. They also explored guerrilla strategies, sabotage, and deception, attempting to level the playing field despite their smaller numbers. Despite all these efforts, every plan seemed to fall short. Every attempt to protect their cities and people was met with overwhelming resistance. The alien leaders realized that they were facing a force that could not be defeated through their usual methods alone. The enemy was too strong, too cunning, and too relentless. Every victory was temporary, and every defeat brought them closer to the brink of disaster. It was in this atmosphere of fear, frustration, and growing desperation that the idea of reaching beyond their own world began to take shape. The aliens had always known that the universe was vast, populated by countless civilizations of varying power, intelligence, and morality. They had, for centuries, exchanged knowledge with other species through trade. science, and cultural exchange, but direct military alliances were rare. Most species kept to themselves, wary of involvement in conflicts that might endanger their own interests. However, in their moment of crisis, the alien leaders began to consider an option that had previously seemed unthinkable: asking for help from a species far beyond their own in power and capability. This was not just a strategic decision. It was a leap of faith, a gamble that could either save their civilization or doom it entirely to attempt this. The aliens used every tool at their disposal. They activated long-range communication arrays, devices capable of sending signals across hundreds of light years, reaching potential allies they had never contacted before. The process was complex and delicate. They had to encode their message carefully, describing the threat they faced while appealing to the intelligence, morality, or self-interest of the recipients. They also had to ensure the signal would be recognizable, strong enough to be received without distortion across vast distances. Every word, every symbol mattered. A single mistake could mean the difference between being understood and being ignored, or worse, being misinterpreted. For weeks, engineers, linguists, and strategists worked tirelessly to craft the perfect message, aware that this could be their civilization's final hope. When the signal was finally sent, a sense of tentative hope spread among the alien leaders and citizens alike. They waited anxiously for any sign of response. The days passed slowly, each one stretching longer than the last. Rumors began to circulate about what might happen if help arrived. Some imagined benevolent allies landing to bolster their defenses, deploying advanced technologies and strategies that could turn the tide immediately. Others feared that they might attract attention from a species far more powerful than they had imagined, and that any intervention could come with unintended consequences. These debates highlighted the complexity of their situation. They were desperate, yet uncertain, hopeful, yet fearful. Every alien, from the highest-ranking official to the youngest citizen, felt the tension of waiting, knowing that their survival or the destruction of everything they had built might hinge on the response to this desperate plea. As the days turned into weeks, the atmosphere on the planet became charged with anticipation. Schools held special assemblies to explain to young citizens that their world was in crisis. Communities organized defense drills, just in case help arrived too late or failed to materialize. Markets buzzed with rumors and speculation, as everyone tried to understand what might come next. Even those who had been skeptical of the idea of calling for external assistance could not help but hope that some answer would arrive, a force capable of turning their precarious situation into a victory. There was a strange mixture of excitement and dread, a cocktail of emotions that only a species facing existential danger could experience. Every alien felt the weight of their civilization's fate pressing down upon them, and every citizen hoped, prayed, or simply imagined that they might live to see the day when the threat was gone. And then, one night, under the twin moons that bathed the planet in silver light, the first signs of response appeared on the horizon. Lights unlike anything the aliens had ever seen blinked across the sky. Massive shapes moved through the upper atmosphere, their size and form unlike any natural object or known spacecraft. The citizens gathered in awe and fear, staring upward as the signals approached. Leaders convened emergency councils to try to interpret the intentions of these new arrivals. The air was thick with anticipation and anxiety. For the first time, the aliens realized that their plea for help had not gone unanswered, and that the universe was far larger, more unpredictable, and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. What had begun as a desperate hope was about to become a test of survival, understanding, and courage on a scale they had never faced before. At that moment, the aliens understood something fundamental. They had acted out of desperation, but they had no real understanding of the forces they were about to unleash. Their civilization, fragile though it was about to be transformed in ways that no one could predict. The signal they had sent was more than a call for help. It was a doorway into the unknown, a step into a universe where power was absolute, and the consequences of summoning it were unimaginable. And so, on that distant planet, under the light of alien moons and amidst the beauty and danger of their world, the stage was set for a story of survival, fear, courage, and the unanticipated consequences of reaching beyond one's own abilities for help. After the aliens sent their desperate call for help into the vast emptiness of space, a tense period of waiting began. A time that stretched like an eternity. Every alien, from the leaders in their gleaming towers to the citizens in distant villages, felt the weight of uncertainty pressing upon them. The message they had sent was a hope-filled lifeline, a desperate plea to forces beyond their understanding. Yet the silence that followed was both ominous and suffocating. Some tried to maintain calm, going about their daily routines, attempting to live as though nothing had changed. Children played in the shimmering forests, unaware of the existential threat that loomed over their home. Farmers tended to crops that grew in soils rich with minerals, oblivious to the fact that their labor might soon be interrupted by forces far beyond their comprehension. Traders continued to move goods between floating cities, carrying supplies and necessities, hoping that the calm would last a little longer. But beneath this fragile semblance of normalcy, anxiety thrived. Parents whispered worries to one another under the silver light of the twin moons. sharing rumors of what might arrive from the distant corners of the universe. Citizens speculated endlessly about the identity of those who might answer their call. Some imagined allies who were as benevolent as they were powerful, entities who would arrive with technology and strategies that could instantly turn the tide of the conflict. Others feared being so different from them that their very presence would be terrifying. A force whose methods could be indiscriminate and whose intentions might not align with the aliens' own values. The uncertainty gnawed at everyone, for no one could predict whether help would come as salvation or as a new danger. Meanwhile, the alien leaders were consumed with preparation. In the high towers and command centers, they worked tirelessly to monitor the skies and track any potential signs of response. They recalculated trajectories, adjusted communication arrays, and ran simulations of possible scenarios. Advisors and strategists filled the rooms, each presenting calculations and predictions. Some argued for patience, suggesting that the signal had only just reached its destination and that an answer might be delayed by light years of distance. Others urged immediate readiness, warning that the arrival of any external forces could be sudden, unpredictable, and possibly catastrophic if the planet was unprepared. Debate stretched into endless hours, sometimes continuing late into the twin-sunned nights. Every decision, every precaution, was examined from countless angles, as though by sheer intensity of thought they could prepare for a reality they had never encountered. Outside the towers, the general population felt the weight of uncertainty in ways both subtle and overt. Markets once vibrant and lively carried an air of tension. Merchants spoke in hushed tones, glancing at the skies for unusual flashes of light, rumors of alien fleets, or signs of distant technology. Children sensed the tension in the voices of adults and the hurried footsteps of citizens going about their routines. In the streets and plazas, community gatherings focused on preparing for both hope and disaster. People learned emergency drills, stockpiled essential supplies, and created shelters in forests, caves, and mountains, even as they attempted to continue their daily lives. The feeling that the unknown might arrive at any moment hung over them like a dark cloud. The planet itself, stunningly beautiful and serene by day, seemed to mirror this anxiety at night, its twin moons casting long shadows that danced over the valleys and forests, reminding everyone of the fragile balance between safety and peril. Weeks passed, and still, the message remained unanswered. The aliens became increasingly restless, and their hope began to mix with a creeping fear. Some questioned whether their plea had been sent correctly, whether the signal had reached any intelligent life at all. Engineers rechecked transmission arrays, rewired systems, and even attempted to send repeat messages, fearing that silence might mean failure. Citizens, meanwhile, grappled with their imaginations. Every unusual flash in the sky, every meteor or cosmic event, was analyzed and debated. Children would run to the edges of villages at the first sight of strange lights, while adults tried to calm their fears with reason, logic, and hope. The anticipation became a shared experience that bound the community together, even as it exposed the fragility of their civilization during this period. The enemy that had driven the aliens to call for help continued its relentless assault, though the intensity varied. There were moments of temporary calm, when skirmishes subsided, giving the aliens a brief chance to regroup and reinforce defenses. But even these intervals of peace were tinged with fear, for everyone knew that the enemy was patient and adaptable, capable of striking again with devastating force. Cities remained fortified, towers manned with scouts, and energy barriers strengthened at every entrance. Citizens volunteered for defensive duties, some trained in emergency combat techniques, while others provided medical aid or logistical support. Life had become a mixture of preparation and waiting, a delicate balance where survival depended not only on skill and technology but also on the hope that the distant response they had sought would arrive before it was too late. It was during this tense waiting period that the aliens' imagination began to shape reality. They speculated endlessly about the nature of the potential saviors who might arrive. Some described enormous beings with incomprehensible intelligence, capable of perceiving every threat instantly and countering it with perfection. Others imagined entities that communicated in strange ways, using vibrations, energy fields, or forms of thought alien to their understanding. Artisans and scholars tried to depict these beings in drawings, holograms, and simulations, though each attempt fell far short of capturing the reality they feared and hoped would come. Stories emerged in the public imagination. Some told of saviors who would protect and nurture, others of beings whose sheer power would inadvertently cause destruction, like a tidal wave that could not be controlled once unleashed. These tales, shared in marketplaces and homes, schools and councils, became part of the collective consciousness, shaping expectations and anxieties alike. Amidst all this speculation, the first tangible signs of potential intervention appeared in small, almost imperceptible ways. Sensors picked up faint disturbances in the far reaches of the system, anomalies that did not resemble natural phenomena. Scouts detected movements in distant asteroid belts, shadows that seemed deliberate and calculated rather than random. communications teams received fleeting, scrambled signals that hinted at intelligent response. Though the messages were incomplete and difficult to interpret, each of these signs ignited a spark of hope within the population. Though the uncertainty remained, the aliens were caught in a paradoxical state. Optimism fueled their spirits, but fear governed their actions. Every sign of life responding to their call was celebrated, but every uncertainty reminded them of the danger of relying on unknown forces. As anticipation continued, the alien society adapted to the constant tension. Education shifted to include emergency survival strategies, with lessons on how to react to sudden threats or alien technologies. Cultural rituals evolved to honor the uncertainty of life and the hope that help might arrive. Communities reinforced cooperation, knowing that only through collective action could they endure the waiting period. People developed routines that balanced daily life with preparedness. From farmers learning to hide essential crops to engineers designing rapid deployment defense systems, even art, music, and literature reflected the strange mixture of hope and anxiety that defined this era. Songs told stories of distant helpers and cosmic uncertainty, while visual artists created murals depicting the unknown, both terrifying and magnificent, waiting in the vastness of space. At the same time, the alien leaders became increasingly concerned with timing. They debated whether to continue holding their civilization in suspense or to act proactively, perhaps attempting to create their own solutions while waiting for the unknown allies to arrive. Some argued that reliance on external help was dangerous, that they could not predict the intentions, methods, or morality of a distant species. Others countered that the scale of the threat made independent action nearly impossible. Their survival might depend entirely on intervention from beyond. These debates were intense, sometimes fracturing the councils and alliances within leadership circles. Every option carried risk, and no decision could be made without careful consideration of potential consequences. The uncertainty became as much a strategic challenge as the enemy itself. Finally, as the weeks stretched into months, the first clear signs of response began to materialize. The distant points of light that had once seemed random grew brighter, larger, and more defined. Sensors confirmed movement patterns consistent with intelligent navigation, and the alien population could no longer deny that they were not alone in their struggle. The reality of imminent contact began to sink in. Citizens gathered in open spaces to watch the skies, hearts pounding with a mix of fear, curiosity, and anticipation. Leaders convened for final assessments, calculating the best ways to interact with what was approaching. Every sensor reading, every observation, every minor detail became critical. The long period of waiting had sharpened their senses, heightened their awareness, and forced the aliens to consider the incomprehensible scale of what they had invoked. Through it all, the emotional landscape of the population shifted in subtle but profound ways. Hope became tinged with fear, optimism laced with anxiety. The alien species learned to balance expectation with caution, to prepare for the best possible outcome while bracing for consequences they could not yet imagine. The waiting period had become a crucible, testing not only their resilience but also their capacity for imagination, foresight, and adaptability. In those tense months, the aliens discovered strengths within themselves they had never known, as well as vulnerabilities that could no longer be ignored. Every citizen, whether in the highest towers or the deepest forests, felt the transformative power of waiting, a force that shaped their minds, their society, and their very sense of what survival might mean. And so, as the first unmistakable signs of external intervention appeared on the horizon, the aliens stood on the threshold of a new reality. The period of waiting, preparation, and imagination had prepared them for what was to come, yet no amount of anticipation could fully convey the magnitude of the forces that would soon arrive. The planet, stunning and fragile, held its collective breath, knowing that the next phase of their struggle, contact, confrontation, and the unpredictable consequences of asking for help was about to begin. The aliens had reached beyond their world in search of salvation, and in doing so, they had set the stage for a story that would test their civilization in ways that no simulation, strategy, or preparation could fully encompass. As the first signs of external intervention became undeniable, the aliens' fragile sense of hope was immediately complicated by fear and uncertainty. For months they had lived in anticipation, imagining that help would arrive in forms they could control or understand. They had envisioned careful, precise assistance, allies who would support their defenses, bolster their strategies, and eliminate the immediate threat without causing further chaos. But when the first massive objects appeared in the skies above their cities, even the most optimistic citizens realized that reality would be far different from their expectations. The newcomers, moving with unmatched speed and precision, were unlike anything they had ever seen. They were colossal, intimidating, and alien beyond comprehension. Their surfaces gleamed with metallic sheen that reflected the twin sun's light, and their engines radiated energy that caused the air to vibrate with a low, resonant hum. The scale alone was enough to inspire awe, but there was also a sense of inherent danger. These were beings whose power could not be measured by any standard. The aliens had known. The initial awe quickly turned to alarm. Scouts and observers, positioned across the planet's highest towers and outer regions, reported movements that were precise and deliberate. The newcomers did not hesitate, did not negotiate, and did not communicate in ways the aliens could easily understand. It became clear that they operated according to rules that were utterly alien, guided by principles the indigenous species could not predict. At first, the aliens tried to map the newcomers' actions to their own understanding of warfare, strategy, and coordination. They assumed that these beings would analyze the battlefield, identify threats, and strike only at those they had been asked to neutralize. But the reality was far more overwhelming. Every movement the newcomers made seemed absolute, precise, and ruthless in its efficiency, as if the very concept of restraint was foreign to them. The first encounter occurred near the outskirts of a city that had been under siege by the enemy forces for weeks. Alien scouts watched as the enormous ships descended, hovering in formation with a terrifying majesty. The enemy, previously confident in their advances, initially did not recognize the magnitude of what had arrived. Within moments, the newcomers' weapons fired with precision that the aliens could hardly comprehend. Entire enemy battalions were obliterated almost instantly, erased from the battlefield in ways that made the aliens' own defensive technology seem primitive by comparison. From a tactical perspective, the alien leaders understood that the threat they had feared, the invaders, was vanquished with remarkable speed and effectiveness. Yet, as they observed, a chilling realization settled over them. The scale of destruction was immense, and collateral damage was inevitable. Buildings were destroyed, landscapes were scorched, and entire districts were flattened in the pursuit of eliminating the enemy. Citizens were torn between relief and terror. The streets were filled with cheers at first, for the immediate threat had been neutralized. Yet those celebrations quickly gave way to horror as the scale of the destruction became visible. Homes, markets, and familiar landmarks had been reduced to rubble. Natural areas, once teeming with life, had been scorched by energy blasts that no defense could withstand. Even as the aliens realized they were being saved, they understood that survival had come at a terrible price. Parents clutched their children tightly, witnessing both the awe-inspiring power of these newcomers and the terrifying consequences of their intervention. Scholars and engineers ran calculations to understand how such forces could be controlled, but the sheer magnitude of the newcomers' capabilities made it clear that no conventional knowledge could fully predict their behavior. For the alien leaders, the rising conflict created a dilemma that was impossible to ignore. On one hand, their civilization had been spared immediate annihilation, and the enemy forces had been decisively neutralized. On the other hand, the method of intervention had introduced chaos on a scale that was difficult to quantify. Bridges that connected floating platforms had been obliterated, energy conduits disrupted, and critical infrastructure damaged. Even cities that had been spared direct attacks suffered from shockwaves and collateral effects, leaving them partially inoperative. Leaders struggled to maintain order while simultaneously managing the emotional and physical fallout of what had occurred. They realized that, while they had gained powerful allies, these allies operated according to principles that were entirely alien, and their methods were indiscriminate in ways that could threaten the very civilization they sought to protect. As the weeks progressed, the newcomers continued their operations. Unlike conventional forces, they did not communicate their strategies or intentions in ways the aliens could understand. Instead, they acted decisively, moving from one battlefield to the next with mechanical efficiency. Entire enemy fleets were destroyed without warning, and previously fortified positions collapsed almost instantly. The aliens could see the patterns, but they could not predict them. Every action by the newcomers sent ripples through society. Areas that had been prepared for defense suddenly became unrecognizable after a single strike. Citizens had to adapt quickly, finding safe zones in regions that remained structurally intact while avoiding areas that had been targeted indiscriminately. Even leaders, with access to advanced simulation tools, found themselves reacting to events in real time rather than controlling outcomes. The rising conflict was not only external but internal. The aliens had to grapple with fear, awe, and the realization that their civilization was being shaped by forces beyond their comprehension. Communication among the alien population became increasingly urgent. Communities sought guidance from leaders, while scientists and strategists attempted to interpret the newcomers' actions. Theories abounded. Some believed the newcomers were acting purely on instinct or programmed directives, with no understanding of the alien concept of collateral damage. Others argued that their actions were deliberate, a calculated approach to teach the aliens a lesson about power, consequences, and reliance on external forces. Regardless of interpretation, the consensus was clear. The newcomers were overwhelmingly powerful, and the aliens had to adapt quickly or face unintended consequences. Fear mingled with respect, creating a tense atmosphere in which every decision, movement, and observation carried immense weight. The aliens' enemy, meanwhile, was decimated but not entirely absent. Small remnants of forces attempted to regroup, only to be immediately neutralized by the newcomers. Those who survived were forced to retreat into uncharted regions of the planet, seeking refuge in environments where even the newcomers' extraordinary capabilities might be limited. The enemy's desperation mirrored the aliens' own fear, though for very different reasons. They realized that the help the aliens had called for was not a conventional ally but a force of overwhelming power and total efficiency. The remaining enemy factions spread word among themselves, describing the newcomers as unstoppable, relentless, and terrifying. This knowledge created additional pressure on the aliens, who recognized that their survival now depended not only on external intervention but also on navigating the consequences of summoning forces they could barely understand. As the conflict escalated, the aliens' leaders took extraordinary measures to protect their people. Emergency shelters were expanded, evacuation protocols refined, and communication lines reinforced. Yet despite these preparations, there were moments of chaos. Entire regions had to be abandoned temporarily to avoid the collateral effects of newcomers' attacks. Citizens were relocated, sometimes without full knowledge of what was happening or why. Families were separated, communities displaced, and long-standing cultural and social structures disrupted. Even as the immediate threat from the enemy diminished, the aliens faced the rising conflict of surviving the consequences of the help they had summoned. Their civilization was saved, but the cost of that salvation became increasingly evident with each passing day. In private moments, leaders and citizens alike reflected on the nature of power. They realized that the universe was far vaster, more dangerous, and more complex than they had previously imagined. The newcomers were neither benevolent nor cruel in human terms. They were entities operating according to principles and logic entirely alien to the indigenous species. To survive, the aliens had to acknowledge both their dependence on these outsiders and the limits of that dependence. Trust could not be assumed, and control could not be exerted. They had reached beyond themselves in a moment of desperation, and now they had to navigate the consequences of that choice with courage, adaptability, and humility. The rising conflict also forced the aliens to confront profound ethical and philosophical questions. Was it right to call upon a force so powerful that it could act indiscriminately, potentially harming their own people even as it eliminated the enemy? Could survival justify the destruction that inevitably came with such intervention? These questions were debated endlessly in council chambers, private homes, and public forums. Scholars, ethicists, and religious leaders all weighed in, offering perspectives rooted in centuries of knowledge, tradition, and morality. Yet no consensus emerged. The rising conflict had revealed not only the external dangers of their universe but also the internal vulnerabilities of their civilization, exposing moral and strategic challenges that could not be solved with technology or brute force alone. As the days turned into weeks, the aliens began to observe patterns in the newcomers' methods. While they could not predict every action, they began to understand certain tendencies. Targets were struck decisively. Threats were neutralized without hesitation, and areas of potential danger were systematically addressed. This understanding allowed the aliens to make small adjustments, guiding citizens to safer zones and mitigating some collateral damage. Yet even with these precautions, the newcomers' operations remained overwhelming. The sheer scale of their power dwarfed anything the aliens had known or imagined, and every intervention carried both relief and terror. Survival was no longer guaranteed. It was earned moment by moment, by understanding, adapting, and respecting forces far beyond comprehension. In many ways, the rising conflict became a transformative period for the aliens. They had called for help, and help had arrived, but it was not the controlled, precise assistance they had hoped for. It was a force of nature, unstoppable and indiscriminate, whose methods forced the aliens to confront the realities of power, dependence, and consequence. The conflict reshaped their society, tested their resilience, and challenged every assumption they had held about the universe. Citizens who had once lived in comfort and security were now active participants in a struggle for survival that required constant vigilance, flexibility, and courage. It became clear that the aliens' lives had changed irrevocably. The enemy had been defeated, yet the rising conflict had revealed the full scope of what it meant to summon forces beyond one's control. The population had survived the immediate threats, but they had also endured psychological, social, and infrastructural disruption on a scale they had never imagined. The planet itself bore scars, from scorched landscapes to altered ecosystems, as evidence of the newcomers' decisive intervention. And most importantly, the aliens had learned a lesson that would shape their civilization for generations. Power beyond comprehension can save, but it can also destroy, and every call for help carries consequences that must be reckoned with long after the immediate crisis has passed. The moment the aliens had long feared finally arrived. The initial awe at the arrival of the newcomers, the colossal, unstoppable forces, had gradually transformed into an uncomfortable realization. They were not in control, and their civilization was hanging by a thread. Weeks of observation, adjustment, and partial understanding of the newcomers' methods had done little to alleviate the tension. What had started as hope had slowly become fear, tinged with regret. The alien leaders, who had once confidently sent the distress signal into the void of space, now sat in command chambers with grim expressions, reviewing reports that grew more alarming with each passing hour. The survivors of cities struck by the newcomers' interventions were traumatized, their once bustling streets reduced to ruins, their homes and workplaces gone in a matter of moments. The aliens had called for help, but in doing so, they had unleashed a power they could neither predict nor control, and the consequences were beginning to mount in ways that no one had anticipated. The breaking point was not sudden. It built slowly, like a storm gathering strength on the horizon. At first, the aliens told themselves that the damage, though immense, was necessary. Their enemies had been eliminated, and survival was the ultimate goal. Entire cities, flattened by precision strikes and energy discharges, were rationalized as unfortunate but unavoidable sacrifices. Leaders held press conferences and community assemblies, speaking of the necessity of difficult decisions, praising the newcomers' efficiency, and encouraging citizens to remain calm. Children were shielded from the worst details, though many saw for themselves the devastation surrounding them. Parents tried to explain, but their voices trembled as they spoke of forces beyond comprehension. The aliens understood that survival often came at a cost, yet the cost of this survival now seemed far greater than they could endure without. Suffering as the newcomers continued their operations, the alien population began to fracture. Communities that had once cooperated seamlessly now found themselves divided. Some argued for gratitude, insisting that survival, no matter the price, was reason enough to accept the newcomers' methods. They spoke of the enemy that had been obliterated, the lives that had been saved, and the fact that their civilization still existed, however battered. Others, however, could not reconcile the destruction with the idea of salvation. They pointed to homes, marketplaces, and sacred sites reduced to rubble. They spoke of the psychological toll, the trauma inflicted upon the population, and the irreversible changes to their world. The debate was no longer abstract. It was deeply personal, touching every citizen in ways that stirred anger, fear, and despair. Families argued over what was right, communities debated leadership decisions, and councils struggled to maintain unity in a society that was fraying at the edges. The alien leaders, tasked with guiding their civilization through this unprecedented crisis, faced extraordinary pressure. Every decision carried consequences that could ripple across generations. Should they continue to rely on the newcomers' intervention, risking further destruction for the sake of total victory against their enemies? Or should they attempt to regain control, perhaps negotiating limitations on the newcomers' actions, even though the aliens lacked the power or influence to enforce such restrictions? Some leaders argued that withdrawal was impossible, that once a signal had been sent and the newcomers had arrived, the aliens had no choice but to accept whatever methods were used to secure survival. Others believed that immediate action was necessary, seeking ways to communicate constraints, establish boundaries, or even repel the newcomers if their actions became too destructive. These debates often lasted through nights, with leaders poring over sensor readings, analyzing damage reports, and consulting advisors in an effort to grasp the full scale of the situation. Yet, despite all their calculations, the newcomers' logic remained alien, and the aliens were left with little certainty other than that their world was changing irrevocably. The psychological impact on the citizens was profound. People who had once lived normal, predictable lives were now thrust into a constant state of alertness and anxiety. Survivors wandered through cities in shock, observing ruined infrastructure and displaced families. Children who had grown up under the twin suns, who once played freely among crystalline mountains and rivers, now learned to navigate debris, avoid unstable buildings, and understand the terrifying consequences of power beyond their comprehension. Parents struggled to explain the incomprehensible, that help had arrived and yet brought devastation, that survival had been secured and yet at great cost. The emotional toll was compounded by a creeping sense of helplessness. Even with the alien leaders' best efforts, there was no guarantee that future interventions would be less destructive. Fear of the unknown had replaced hope, and for many, the planet itself seemed transformed. No longer a sanctuary but a battlefield between forces far beyond their control. In the midst of this chaos, the aliens' enemies, though largely defeated, had not disappeared entirely. Small remnants continued to resist, retreating into hidden regions where the newcomers' overwhelming power might be limited. These pockets of resistance were hunted relentlessly, sometimes with devastating consequences for surrounding regions. Citizens who lived near these areas were forced to flee or take extreme precautions. Entire towns were evacuated, often with little warning. As the newcomers struck decisively to eliminate even the smallest threats, the aliens were caught in a cruel paradox. They had survived the enemy, yet survival now required navigating the destructive consequences of the very help that had saved them. Each strike, while strategically brilliant, carried unintended side effects that made the alien population question whether the cost of victory was too high. Tensions reached a peak when one of the largest cities, a hub of commerce, education, and culture, it became the site of an unexpected surge in destruction. The newcomers, operating according to principles the aliens could not predict, targeted a massive concentration of enemy remnants near the city outskirts. What the aliens expected to be a controlled strike became a shockwave of power that, affected not only the enemy but also civilian infrastructure. Buildings collapsed, energy grids failed, and entire districts were rendered uninhabitable. The alien leaders received reports of casualties, displacement, and widespread panic. Citizens fled, families were separated, and chaos enveloped the city. For many, the breaking point had arrived. The fear, stress, and trauma that had been building over weeks now erupted in full force, overwhelming both the population and the governing authorities. The aftermath of this particular strike forced a reckoning. Councils convened emergency sessions, attempting to assess the scale of destruction, provide aid to survivors, and manage the psychological impact on citizens. Leaders confronted the reality that the newcomers' actions, while eliminating the immediate threat, had created a new crisis, managing the consequences of survival itself. Relief efforts were complicated by damaged infrastructure, communication breakdowns, and the constant fear of further intervention. The alien population, already fatigued by weeks of tension, faced exhaustion, grief, and anger. Communities that had survived intact struggled to comprehend the scale of destruction just a few kilometers away. Families mourned the loss of homes, cultural sites, and even loved ones. The breaking point was not just a moment of physical crisis, it was a psychological and social rupture, shaking the foundations of the alien civilization itself. In private, many leaders reflected on the ethical and moral dilemmas of the situation. They had acted out of desperation, seeking survival in the face of an overwhelming enemy. Yet the methods of their saviors had exposed the limits of control, showing that reliance on forces far beyond their comprehension came with costs that were almost impossible to measure. Some leaders wrestled with guilt, wondering if they had endangered their people by calling for help. Others argued that survival justified any cost, that the alternative, complete annihilation, left no room for regret. These internal debates mirrored the broader societal tension, highlighting that the breaking point was not only external but deeply internal, challenging every assumption about morality, responsibility, and the balance between survival and consequence. The psychological strain on ordinary citizens continued to intensify. Daily life became an exercise in constant vigilance and adaptation. Schools, previously places of learning and exploration, were converted into temporary shelters. Children were taught not only academic subjects but also survival techniques, how to recognize safe zones, how to respond to sudden attacks, and how to navigate the unpredictable patterns of destruction caused by the newcomers. Families moved frequently, seeking refuge in regions that had remained relatively untouched. Social structures, once stable and predictable, were strained under the weight of trauma and displacement. Fear became a constant companion, anxiety a shared experience, and hope a fragile, almost forbidden concept. Amid this turmoil, the alien population also began to experience a strange duality of emotions. On one hand, they were grateful that the immediate enemy had been eliminated, that their civilization still existed despite the overwhelming threat. On the other hand, they could not ignore the profound cost of this salvation: the destruction of homes, cultural heritage, and social stability. Every citizen felt the tension between gratitude and fear, survival and devastation, hope and despair. The breaking point was not simply a moment of external crisis, it was the culmination of weeks of mounting tension, fear, and moral complexity. The aliens had survived, but survival now demanded resilience, adaptation, and an acceptance of consequences far beyond their control. Even the landscape of the planet reflected this crisis. Cities that had been bustling centers of trade and culture were scarred with ruins and debris. Forests had been scorched by energy discharges. Rivers and lakes, once pristine, were disrupted by shockwaves and collateral damage. The natural balance of the planet had been altered in subtle and overt ways, reminding every citizen of the transformative power unleashed by their call for help. Survival was no longer simply about living through the enemy threat, it was about navigating a world irrevocably changed by forces beyond comprehension. The breaking point had been reached, not only in terms of human or alien, but in the very fabric of the planet itself. Calling for help in desperation can save lives, but it also comes with consequences that are unpredictable, uncontrollably, and sometimes devastating. The aliens had learned, through fear, destruction, and survival, that external power cannot be contained or fully directed. Even as they celebrated the defeat of their enemies, they could not ignore the cost of that victory. The breaking point was a lesson in humility, resilience, and the limits of control. A moment that would define the alien civilization for generations. Their world had been saved, but at a price that no one could ignore, and the scars, physical, emotional, and cultural, would shape the society for decades to come. After the breaking point, when fear, destruction, and uncertainty had reached their peak, the alien civilization faced a crucial moment, the time to rebuild, reorganize, and regain some semblance of control. The initial shock of witnessing the newcomers' overwhelming power and the resulting devastation had left them dazed, traumatized, and unsure of their next steps. For weeks the planet had been a landscape of chaos, with once vibrant cities reduced to rubble, forests scorched, and rivers and lakes disrupted by energy blasts. Citizens had fled to makeshift shelters, families had been separated, and even the leadership had struggled to maintain order. But the threat had been neutralized. The enemy had been decisively defeated. Survival was no longer an immediate question, and for the first time in what felt like months, the aliens could breathe, even if just slightly. The immediate challenge, however, was monumental. The destruction wrought by the newcomers was not just a matter of lost buildings or destroyed infrastructure. It had shaken the very foundations of society. Markets, schools, energy networks, and transportation hubs were all affected. Communities that had thrived for generations were fragmented, and the emotional and psychological toll on citizens was profound. Families wandered through the ruins of their neighborhoods, trying to salvage personal belongings, recover loved ones, and understand the full extent of the damage. Children, once carefree, had been exposed to fear and trauma beyond their understanding, and the elders, who had seen the planet through decades of relative stability, now faced the reality that the world they had known was forever changed. Despite these challenges, the alien leaders began to act with determination. They organized relief efforts with whatever resources remained, establishing temporary shelters, food distribution points, and emergency medical stations. Citizens were mobilized to assist in rebuilding efforts, creating a sense of purpose and agency amidst the chaos. Even as they worked to repair the damage, leaders made it clear that the presence of the newcomers had permanently altered their approach to survival. While their arrival had saved the civilization, it had also highlighted the limits of their control and the need to prepare for unforeseen consequences in the future. Every action was deliberate, every resource carefully allocated, and every citizen encouraged to contribute in ways that would both aid recovery and restore a sense of normalcy. The alien population's response to this effort was remarkable. Communities came together, supporting one another with resilience and determination that seemed to grow in proportion to the challenges they faced. Individuals who had previously lived isolated lives now worked side by side, clearing debris, reconstructing homes, and sharing scarce resources. Schools and academies reopened, focusing not only on traditional learning but also on survival skills, emergency planning, and disaster response. Citizens, young and old, adapted to their new reality, learning to navigate the changed landscape while maintaining hope for the future. The sense of unity, forged in the crucible of crisis, but became a driving force behind the recovery, demonstrating that even in the aftermath of overwhelming destruction, society could endure and rebuild simultaneously. The alien leaders began to reassess their relationship with the newcomers. Initially, they had been awed, fearful, and grateful, yet the breaking point had revealed the dangers of relying on forces beyond their understanding. Now, with the immediate threat gone, leaders sought to establish communication and boundaries, aiming to negotiate a way to coexist without further damage. They attempted to analyze the newcomers' behavior, looking for patterns, tendencies, and motivations. While complete understanding remained impossible, the aliens discovered that the newcomers operated with a consistent logic, a framework that, once interpreted, allowed for limited predictions of their actions. This newfound insight gave the leaders a measure of confidence, enabling them to prepare for future contingencies while respecting the power and unpredictability of these cosmic allies. The resolution phase was not without its challenges. While some areas of the planet were relatively intact, others had been devastated beyond immediate repair. Citizens faced difficult choices whether to rebuild in place, relocate to safer regions, or adapt to entirely new forms of habitation. Temporary structures were erected, blending advanced technology with practical simplicity. Floating platforms were stabilized, energy conduits rerouted, and defensive systems upgraded not to wage war, but to safeguard against potential threats. Recovery efforts became a balance between immediate survival needs and long-term planning, requiring careful coordination and cooperation across all levels of society. Leaders recognized that rebuilding was not merely a physical task but also a psychological one, aiming to restore confidence, trust, and a sense of agency among citizens who had endured immense trauma. Cultural and emotional recovery was equally important. Communities held ceremonies to honor those lost in the chaos and to acknowledge the resilience of those who had survived. Stories of courage, sacrifice, and perseverance were shared widely, reinforcing collective identity and purpose. Artists, musicians, and writers played a critical role in translating the experiences of the population into creative expressions, helping to process fear, grief, and hope. Even children participated, contributing drawings, songs, and performances that celebrated survival and adaptation. These cultural efforts provided a shared language for understanding the crisis and its aftermath, fostering unity and helping the population reclaim a sense of normalcy amid ongoing recovery efforts. Economic and technological restoration became a parallel focus. Engineers and scientists worked tirelessly to repair energy networks, reconstruct transportation hubs, and restore communication systems. Trade routes were reopened, though initially limited, to facilitate the movement of resources, food, and medical supplies. Markets gradually regained their function, with citizens engaging in commerce not only to meet practical needs but also as a symbol of resilience and continuity. Technology that had been damaged or disrupted was rebuilt, often incorporating lessons learned from the newcomers' intervention. This included creating systems designed for efficiency, durability, and adaptability, ensuring that the civilization could better withstand future threats. Every repaired structure and restored system became a testament to both ingenuity and the determination to survive against overwhelming odds. The aliens also had to address the psychological scars left by the newcomers' intervention. Trauma was widespread, with citizens reporting fear, anxiety, and nightmares. Counseling services were established, drawing on both scientific understanding and traditional methods of emotional support. Communities organized group sessions, storytelling circles, and educational workshops to help individuals process their experiences. Leaders encouraged open dialogue about fear, loss, and hope, emphasizing that acknowledging trauma was a critical part of recovery. Over time, citizens began to develop coping mechanisms, learning to integrate the lessons of survival into their daily lives while maintaining optimism for the future. The psychological resilience of the population became as crucial as the physical rebuilding, providing the foundation for a society capable of facing future challenges. As recovery progressed, the alien leaders began to document every aspect of the crisis, creating detailed records of the enemy threat, the intervention by the newcomers, and the resulting consequences. These records served multiple purposes. They provided historical documentation, guided future planning, and offered a reference for understanding the behavior of external forces. Scholars, strategists, and engineers analyzed the data meticulously, seeking patterns, insights, and predictive frameworks. The goal was not only to prevent similar destruction in the future but also to harness knowledge for long-term stability and resilience. This period of reflection and analysis became a cornerstone of the resolution, emphasizing the importance of learning from experience and adapting strategies to navigate a universe where power and unpredictability were constants. International and cooperation played a critical role in the resolution. Previously independent cities and regions, accustomed to managing their own affairs, now collaborated closely to share resources, expertise, and manpower. This collaboration fostered a sense of solidarity and mutual responsibility, reinforcing social cohesion and collective purpose. Citizens participated in rebuilding projects beyond their immediate communities, volunteering time and labor to support neighboring areas in need. Leaders coordinated efforts, ensuring that resources were distributed equitably and that recovery progressed efficiently. The result was a civilization that, while still scarred and traumatized, began to emerge stronger, more unified, and better prepared for future challenges. One of the most significant aspects of the resolution was the population's evolving understanding of power and intervention. The breaking point had demonstrated the dangers of relying on forces beyond comprehension, yet it had also shown the necessity of external assistance in moments of existential threat. The aliens learned to balance gratitude with caution, recognizing that survival sometimes required risk, while also understanding the importance of preparedness, strategy, and limits. This lesson influenced both governance and culture, shaping policies, education, and collective consciousness. Citizens became more vigilant, more resourceful, and more aware of the responsibilities that came with their survival. The resolution was thus not merely about rebuilding what was lost but also about cultivating wisdom, resilience, and foresight. As months passed, the planet slowly transformed from a scene of destruction into a landscape of cautious renewal. Cities rose from the ruins, blending advanced technology with practical adaptation to prevent future catastrophes. Communities stabilized, and citizens gradually returned to routines of work, education, and cultural life. Markets and trade resumed, energy networks were repaired, and transportation systems became functional once more. The alien population had endured the breaking point, learned the consequences of their actions, and adapted to a new reality shaped by both destruction and survival. Recovery was not immediate or easy, but it was steady, deliberate, and guided by the hard-earned wisdom of experience. The immediate threat had been neutralized, the consequences of intervention were being managed, and society had begun to regain stability. Citizens had adapted to a world forever altered by forces beyond their control, learning to navigate both opportunity and danger with resilience. Leadership had evolved, incorporating lessons from the breaking point to guide decision-making and planning. Cultural, economic, and technological systems had been restored, and communities were reconnected both physically and socially. The resolution was not a return to the old normal, it was the establishment of a new normal, one informed by survival, wisdom, and the capacity to endure in a universe filled with power beyond comprehension. Perhaps most importantly, the resolution demonstrated that even after overwhelming destruction, recovery was possible. The alien civilization, scarred and transformed, had survived not only because of the intervention of the newcomers but also because of their own resilience, creativity, and capacity to adapt. They had learned to balance reliance on external power with the necessity of self-determination, to respect forces beyond their control while taking responsibility for their own survival, and to transform trauma into strength. This was a civilization that had faced its darkest hour and emerged, not unscathed, but wiser, stronger, and more prepared to navigate the uncertainties of the universe. The dust had finally begun to settle across the planet, though the marks of devastation remained etched on the land, in the cities, and in the hearts of every citizen. The intervention of the newcomers had saved the alien civilization from certain annihilation, yet it had left scars, both physical and emotional, that would endure for generations. In the aftermath, the aliens faced a complex mixture of relief, gratitude, fear, and profound reflection. Survival had been achieved, but at a cost that no one could ignore. Streets that were once vibrant were still filled with rubble. Forests and rivers bore traces of destructive energy discharges. Homes had been lost, markets were disrupted, and familiar landmarks were altered beyond recognition. Everywhere, the evidence of the breaking point remained, reminding the population that the universe was vast, unpredictable, and, at times, terrifyingly powerful. Leaders convened meetings not only to plan recovery efforts, but also to reflect on the deeper lessons of the crisis. They understood that their civilization had been spared not through their own power, but by forces beyond their comprehension, forces that acted with precision, efficiency, and indifference to collateral damage. The newcomers had neutralized the enemy swiftly and decisively, leaving no room for negotiation or appeal. While the alien population had survived, they had been forced to reckon with the uncomfortable truth that salvation had not come on their own terms. The lessons of this reality became a foundation for a new approach to governance, strategy, and culture. Leaders emphasized vigilance, preparation, and the importance of understanding that reliance on external power could never replace wisdom, adaptability, and resilience. Communities began the long process of rebuilding. Cities were reconstructed not only to restore functionality but also to incorporate lessons learned from the intervention. Structures were designed to withstand unforeseen forces, energy networks were reinforced, and transportation systems were upgraded with redundancies that could prevent future collapse. Citizens worked side by side, clearing debris, reconstructing homes, and salvaging resources. The process was arduous and exhausting, yet there was a collective sense of purpose. Even amidst the trauma, hope slowly returned. Children played among newly rebuilt streets and parks, their laughter a fragile but powerful symbol of resilience. Adults collaborated tirelessly, driven by the knowledge that the survival of their civilization depended on both determination and cooperation. Every brick laid, every structure repaired, and every system restored represented a step toward reclaiming agency over a world that had once seemed uncontrollable. The psychological impact of the events lingered, shaping the collective consciousness of the alien population. Many citizens experienced lingering fear, anxiety, and trauma, having witnessed both the terrifying power of the newcomers and the devastation that accompanied their intervention. Counseling programs were established, combining scientific and traditional approaches to help individuals process their experiences. Storytelling, music, and art became crucial outlets, allowing citizens to express emotions that were otherwise too complex or overwhelming. Communities gathered to share experiences, to honor the losses endured, and to celebrate the resilience demonstrated throughout the crisis. Children participated in these cultural efforts as well, learning from both their elders' experiences and their own observations of survival and adaptation. The emotional reconstruction of society became as essential as the physical rebuilding, reinforcing the idea that true recovery required healing on multiple levels. Scholars and strategists studied every aspect of the crisis meticulously. They recorded the sequence of events, the actions of the enemy, and the intervention of the newcomers, creating extensive archives that would guide future generations. The aim was to extract knowledge, patterns, and insights that could inform long-term survival strategies. Every sensor reading, every energy discharge, every tactical maneuver was analyzed, not with the expectation of controlling the newcomers, but with the goal of understanding them sufficiently to coexist safely in the future. Citizens contributed by documenting personal experiences, collecting data, and observing environmental changes. Over time, this accumulated knowledge became a critical resource, offering guidance on how to navigate a universe in which power, unpredictability, and moral complexity were constants. The alien population also began to reflect on ethical and philosophical questions. The crisis had forced them to confront the consequences of summoning power beyond their understanding. They had called for help in desperation, and the help had arrived, but in a form that was indiscriminate, overwhelming, and transformative. Questions arose. Could the ends justify the means? Was it right to accept salvation that came with such devastating consequences? How should future generations balance the need for survival with ethical considerations, knowing that intervention by external forces could produce both protection and destruction? These discussions permeated every level of society, from council chambers to marketplaces, from schools to private homes. Citizens debated, questioned, and reflected, developing a deeper understanding of responsibility, morality, and the complexity of choices made under duress. At the same time, gratitude for survival was widespread. Citizens and leaders alike acknowledged that, despite the destruction, the newcomers had saved them from certain annihilation. Communities organized ceremonies, festivals, and public gatherings to honor survival and resilience. Monuments were erected not only to commemorate the lives lost and the challenges endured, but also to recognize the intervention that had preserved the civilization itself. Cultural expression, songs, sculptures, literature, and performances emerged as mediums to process collective experience, celebrate perseverance, and acknowledge the complex nature of their salvation. These efforts fostered a sense of shared identity, reinforcing the bonds between citizens and reminding everyone that survival was both a personal and communal achievement. Economically, the society began to stabilize. Markets reopened, trade routes were restored, and energy networks resumed normal function. Reconstruction projects created employment and fostered innovation. As citizens applied creative solutions to challenges imposed by the newcomers' intervention, technological advancements were integrated into the rebuilding process, not only to restore what was lost but also to enhance resilience against future threats. The crisis had accelerated innovation, forcing engineers, scientists, and strategists to develop new methods and approaches for problem solving. Economic recovery was gradual, but the determination and resourcefulness of the population ensured that progress was steady, reliable, and sustainable. One of the most enduring lessons of the aftermath was the understanding of power and dependence. The aliens had survived because they reached beyond their own capabilities, summoning help that was overwhelmingly powerful. Yet, in doing so, they had experienced firsthand the dangers of reliance on forces they could not control. Society internalized this lesson, shaping governance, education, and cultural norms. Leaders emphasized self-reliance, preparation, and adaptability while maintaining a measured respect for external powers. Citizens learned that survival often required difficult decisions, humility in the face of greater forces, and the courage to act responsibly even when outcomes were uncertain. This wisdom became a guiding principle for future generations, ensuring that the experiences of the crisis would continue to inform behavior, choices, and societal priorities. As the planet recovered, citizens began to restore their connection with the natural world. Landscapes that had been damaged by energy discharges and shockwaves were replanted and rehabilitated. Scientists and environmentalists worked tirelessly to restore ecosystems, rehabilitate wildlife, and repair water systems. Forests, rivers, and lakes gradually regained their balance, though scars remained as reminders of the power that had swept through the planet. These efforts reinforced the understanding that recovery extended beyond human or alien. The health of the environment, the sustainability of resources, and the restoration of ecosystems were critical to ensuring long-term survival and resilience. Communities also engaged in intergenerational reflection. Elders shared stories of the crisis with younger generations, providing context, lessons, and wisdom. Children learned not only about survival but also about responsibility, ethics, and the complexity of life in a universe filled with unpredictable forces. These narratives became part of cultural education, ensuring that the experiences, insights, and mistakes of the crisis would be remembered and integrated into societal values. The reflection was both practical and philosophical, reinforcing the importance of learning from the past while preparing for future challenges. Over time, the alien civilization achieved a delicate equilibrium. Citizens rebuilt their homes, restored infrastructure, and re-established social and economic networks. Communities became stronger and more resilient, guided by the lessons of the crisis and the wisdom gained from surviving forces beyond comprehension. While fear and trauma remained as subtle undercurrents, they were balanced by hope, determination, and a renewed sense of purpose. The civilization had endured, not only because of external intervention but also because of collective effort, adaptability, and the courage to face uncertainty. The aftermath had transformed the society, reshaping identity, values, and priorities, leaving a legacy of resilience and insight that would guide generations to come. The alien population understood that survival was never guaranteed, and that the universe contained forces both benevolent and indifferent. They had learned the limits of control, the consequences of desperation, and the responsibilities inherent in summoning help from beyond their understanding. They had witnessed power on a scale beyond imagination, experienced loss and trauma, and endured chaos and destruction. Yet, through reflection, cooperation, and determination, they had reclaimed agency over their civilization, transforming a moment of near annihilation into a foundation for growth, learning, and resilience. The scars of the crisis remained, but they served as reminders of both vulnerability and strength. The reflection phase also solidified a philosophical evolution. The aliens recognized that life in the universe required a balance between hope and caution, reliance and self-determination, action and reflection. They had learned to respect forces beyond their control while also valuing the power of their own collective effort. Education, governance, and cultural practices adapted to integrate these insights, ensuring that future generations would carry forward the lessons of survival, ethical consideration, and resilience. Stories of the crisis became central to their cultural identity, passed down through narratives, art, and education, preserving not only the memory of the events but also the wisdom gained from them. Ultimately, the aftermath and reflection transformed the alien civilization into a society that understood both its vulnerabilities and its strengths. The intervention of the newcomers had been catastrophic and transformative, yet it had also provided an opportunity for growth, learning, and long-term preparation. Citizens, leaders, scholars, and children alike had endured a trial of unprecedented scale and emerged with a renewed understanding of their place in the universe. They had learned to navigate complexity, uncertainty, and moral ambiguity, balancing gratitude for survival with awareness of consequence. The planet, scarred but recovering, stood as a testament to their resilience, adaptability, and capacity for reflection. The aliens realized that life would never return to the exact state it had been before. Yet, in the aftermath, they found purpose, wisdom, and cohesion. They celebrated survival, mourned losses, and committed to rebuilding a civilization stronger, wiser, and more resilient than before. The reflection on what had occurred on the breaking point, the intervention, and the subsequent recovery became central to their identity. It shaped decisions, guided education, and informed strategy, ensuring that the lessons of that extraordinary period would endure. They had survived the unimaginable, and in doing so, they had learned the most profound lesson of all, that survival is not merely about escaping immediate threats but about understanding, adapting, and growing from the trials that shape a civilization.